Hello and welcome to another tutorial on Ziva VFX. In this video we're going to be looking at how we can use the new features in Ziva 1.4 to simulate fat and skin without having to solve fascia as well. So you recall in Ziva 1.3 that on the Ziva cloth materials we had rest scale and pressure. And now what we've done in Ziva 1.4 is we've added rest scale and pressure and a third attribute called surface tension, which I'll talk about in a bit. I've added those attributes to tissue. So now by using material layers, we can negate the need for a fascia completely, which should result in much faster sim times because now you're not having to run an extra cloth sim in order to get the performance out of your fat. So this represents the latest evolution in workflow for doing this stuff. You know, we're always trying to listen to feedback and evolve our methodologies in order for you guys to get the best results. Yeah, so in this scene, I have a closed volume, which represents the fat. It's built using the same methods that we've presented in other videos. So you can still use the cloth solver to help you model the inside layer, which would have been the fascia before. So I still have all those layers. Just hide these outer ones. So we have this inner layer here, and then we have the outer layer, which was projected back to the skin model using Wrap 3 or other tools. And then also I have this border, which is basically a bridge between the two layers. And then with all those kind of combined and merged vertices and normals pointing out, then that represents the fat there. So that's that. And so I've gone and converted that to a tissue object, and I've made attachments at the borders. So the other thing in this scene is I have some inputs. So these are the cached muscles and bones. These are all Ziva bone objects. And this is just one of the bakes that you get with the Mr. Ink stuff from the Ziva free store. Cool. So we only want the new attributes to take effect on the parts of the skin that are adjacent to the underlying objects. So basically all the faces that would have been represented by the fascia before. So what I can do is make a new material layer. I bring back the skin. So under the Ziva menu, with the object selected under the Ziva menu, come down to add tissue property material layer. And now if I look in the channel box, you can see these are kind of named nicely. So I'm going to name my new material here. This is the default. I'll call this skin inner material, like that. And then I'm going to turn the density down to 106, which is a tenth of its original density. And the reason for that is once the character starts moving around, you can kind of quickly run into a situation where there's too much secondary or ballistic motion. And so by setting the density a bit lower, you can kind of reduce that effect. But just a note on that, I mean, you're sort of kind of getting away from physical values at this point, but it is going to help reduce that kind of overshooting of sliding that'll happen. Cool, so if you look at the material for the inner layer here, you'll see that we have these three new attributes. So with rest scale, depending on the value you put in here, it's going to either shrink or grow the tetrahedra in the tet mesh. Pressure is going to function in a similar way as it did with cloth, so it's going to put a force in the normal direction of the surface. And surface tension is a new attribute. I'm just going to switch to paint for this one. So if we draw some triangles here, and these represent the triangles in the surface of our mesh. And if I draw the normals in, like this, surface tension is only going to shrink the tetrahedra in the orthogonal direction to the normal. So, you know, like this. And it's only going to work on the tetrahedra that are directly in contact with the surface mesh. So because the shrinking happens in the orthogonal direction to the normal, it's kind of non-uniform or anisotropic in that respect. So that's how that works. And so I'm going to go ahead and paint this material before I start setting some attributes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of my build layers, the inner layer, and I have a script It's just going to help me do a vertex selection. Actually, what I'll do first is right click on the mesh, come down to Paint, Z Material, Skin Inner Material Weights. You can see it's currently completely white. And I'm just going to flood it to black. That. And then I'm going to come along and use my inner layer mesh. So I hide the skin, use that's the inner layer. And I'll select that first, and then I'm going to select the skin. And I'm going to use a script that I have to help me select the inner vertices. So I just have a select corresponding faces script. And we can look at sharing that if people think they'll find that useful. And then I'll convert the face selection to vertices. And then I can isolate that just to show what I'm doing. And then I'll right click on this, come down to Paint, Z Material, Inner Material Weights. When you do that, you lose your vertex selection. You just have to hit Control Z once and you get it back. And then I'm going to flood this to white. Cool. So now if I was to paint this, you'll see that only the inner part of the surface is painted to white. And what that means is that only the part of the tissue that's adjacent with these underlying objects is going to be affected, which is exactly what we want if we want to replicate the fascia. Cool. So now I'll switch back to the channel box. If I come down to that inner material, I'm going to set surface tension to a value of 45. And you'll remember, just like, oops. And you'll remember that just like with cloth, material properties are not keyable, so there's a corresponding envelope attribute on the tissue node. And so I'm going to set this to 0 because what we want to do is ramp in this effect over time. If you don't ramp it on, there's a pretty high chance that the initial collisions are going to get missed as the solver jumps to try and hit that 45 value on the first frame of simulation. So we need to give the collisions a chance to resolve. So I'm going to key this on solver start frame, and then 5 frames in, I'll set it to 1. And now I'm just going to play that back. So you can see we're getting the collision proxy pair points, which is the green draw stuff. And you can see that the skin mesh is now following along nicely with the underlying objects. See, it's kind of missing a few collisions here. That's probably because my contact stiffness is too low. So I'll make that 10 to the 7. Clear the cache. Clear that back. Hopefully that'll clean that up. Cool. So the other thing that we're going to want to do if we want to replicate the functionality of the fascia is that we need to put a pressure in the normal direction in order to make sure we're kind of revealing the valleys between the muscles and between the bones. And we can now do that on tissue. So if we come down here, I'm going to set pressure to something like 2500. And so if you have just been working with fascia, 2500 will seem quite high. That's just a difference in how tissue responds to these values. So if you are doing this on tissue in Ziva 1.4, these values are going to be a bit higher. So, and just like with surface tension, I'm going to key this on over time. Clear the cache. And I'll play this back. And you can see that it's inflating here because I've put in, it's kind of a cool effect actually. Because I actually need to set the pressure to be negative because the normal direction is different to if I was just doing fascia. So that's something you'll want to do as well. Come down here, make that negative 2500. Clear the cache. Try that again. Play this back. Scrub the timeline a little bit. And so now you should see that the tissue is kind of following along nicely with the underlying objects. And so when it comes to doing your own work with this stuff, you probably want to make sure that the tape mesh is quite a bit finer than I have it. I've left it kind of coarse because otherwise we won't see anything in the viewport while I'm doing this tutorial. So if you were to download the Mr. Ink asset from the free store, you'll notice that the tape mesh is quite a bit finer. Like for instance, in between the legs here, it's kind of meshed between. So you really want to have a finer tape mesh, and then that way you're going to bring back, or you're going to see a lot more kind of nice definition around the muscles. But this is to give you an idea of the workflow. Hide that border object. So this is now how we would recommend people do fat in their characters in Ziva 1.4. So because this works with material layers, there's no limit to the number of layers you can have. So if you wanted to do cool things like maybe you wanted to see more definition under the arm here, what you could do is make another material layer and make its surface tension 0 or much lower than the other layers, and then increase pressure. And what that's going to do is push the fat right up into the armpit, so you get a nicer sort of pocket that way. But yeah, that's basically the workflow now that we would recommend people do going forward with their fat simulations. And yeah, if you have any questions on that, please feel free to post them on the community or email Ziva support, or if you just want to share what you're doing, you can do that as well. Thanks again for watching, and hope you enjoy the new features.